Welcome to the Mythicist Milwaukee Show podcast. Before we get started, we'd like to extend special thanks to all the sponsors of the Myth Information Conference 3 coming up on October 21st at historic Turner Hall in Milwaukee. Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Sophia Wolf Quadracci Memorial Fund for Stem Cell Research, author of the new book Mythos Christos, Edwin Herbert, Atheist Alliance of America, Atheist Republic, Godless Engineer, Kenosha Racine Atheists and Free Thinkers, and the Atheist Community of Milwaukee. Your $300 sponsorship includes a table at the conference, 1 ticket to the event, and 1 ticket to the VIP party, as well as a mention on all of our various social media platforms, including this fine podcast. Buy your tickets and sponsorships at mythicistmilwaukee.com. All of us here at Mythicist Milwaukee would like to thank all of our patrons for supporting this show. And now here's your hosts, Rob Moore and Brian Edward. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. A very, very special edition of the Mythicist Milwaukee Show today. I'm Rob Moore, your host, and with me, as always, is my co-host. He's Brian Edward. What's going on today, Brian?
Definitely excited to talk to Maryam.
Yeah, I want to get right to it. I usually have a little bit of banter and a little bit of nuttiness, but today we're going to get right to it and talk to what is easily, in my opinion, one of the most important guests we've had on in our young year and a half, 2 years of doing this. Our guest today is a political activist, a campaigner, and a blogger. She's an atheist and a co-founder of the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. She was born in Iran, leaving shortly after the Iranian Revolution in '79. Brian, do you remember the heady days of the Ayatollah's ascent to power?
I was 6, so no.
A lot of flag burning, a lot of American. If you like American flags going up in flames, and if you like straw people being burned on the end of a stick, good times. She left there in '79 and began her human rights activism through refugee work in the Sudan and Turkey. These efforts won her the Julia B Friedman Humanitarian Award and the International Rescue Committee Medal in the late 1980s. Her passion for freedom and human rights has won her so many awards that naming them all could easily take up half the time she has generously allotted us here for the podcast. She has spoken at countless events regarding women's rights, free expression, Islamism, and secularism, and has been interviewed by all the major media news outlets. She's co-authored numerous articles, including the fabulously named When Hezbollah Came to My School. I can't even read that without laughing. It's just fabulous. Can you imagine where you're in school and Hezbollah shows up at 5th grade, a little presentation for you, a little beard measuring contest? I don't know what else. She's an advisor to the Raif Badawi Foundation for Freedom. She is the spokesperson for One Law for All and Equal Rights Now campaigns. She hosts a television program. I don't know when she sleeps. Bread and Roses broadcast. The Bread and Roses broadcast. And you know she's making an impact, Brian, because many of Islamic regime's media outlets have called Maryam immoral and corrupt. You know she's winning the fight when that starts happening. There was even an expose on her entitled Meet This Anti-Religion Woman. She's easily one of the most polarizing, controversial figures in our secular movement today. Please welcome from London, England, Maryam Namazie. How are you, Maryam?
Hi, that was such a nice intro. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank Brian for that. He lovingly put that together and insisted that I describe all of your accolades. Tell us right away. What's it like? Do you actually have a fatwa? Is it called on you? Are they looking for you?
Well, I think lots of people who do the work that I do, many of them unknown in the West, though they should be everyone's heroes, really. They're facing problems and death threats via the Islamist movement. I think if you don't have a death threat, then you need to think about what you're doing wrong, basically.
I think that's right.
It's a sad truth, unfortunately.
Brian, take us right to it. He's done a lot of research on what's going on, and everyone's very concerned about the phenomena of Sharia courts popping up in Britain, and I am less educated than the rest of you, so take us right there. What's going on with that in England?
Yeah, well, Sharia courts are basically religious courts, so there are different types of religious courts, and I think they're all bad, and we shouldn't have any of them, whether it's ecclesiastic courts, which you might be better familiar with, the Beth Din, which are the Jewish courts, or the Sharia courts, which are Islamic courts, and they're basically imposing religious laws in areas that are really civil rights matters, human rights matters, and something that religion shouldn't have a say in. So obviously, when you look at Sharia law, it's basically it's based on the Quran. It's based on the Hadith, which are the sayings and actions of Muhammad, Islam's prophet, and it also includes Islamic jurisprudence. So obviously it's practiced in different ways, it's implemented in different ways. I think all of them reactionary. I mean, I know there's good interpretations, bad interpretations according to some. I think you can't interpret religion in a positive way, particularly when it comes to human rights and women's rights and the law. Obviously, people can interpret it any way they want in their own private lives. So it's basically about these religious courts having a say. If you look at places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, the aspects of it that everybody knows of are the criminal hudud ordinances or laws, which include stoning and amputation for theft and, hanging for apostasy or executions for being gay and so on and so forth. The part of the Sharia laws which are being practiced in Britain, for example, are not those, obviously, but they are those that pertain to the family. So marriage, divorce, child custody, issues around domestic violence, marital rape. So a lot of people will say, well, these are personal matters, private matters. They're, it's nobody's business how people manage their family issues. But again, the point that we raise is that these aspects are some of the most discriminatory against women in particular. There's a huge fight back in countries where Sharia law exists, particularly by women's rights movements and liberation movements. And it's very apt to fight against them here in the West as well, because they're denying women in particular their basic rights in the family.
Right. And I think a couple other pieces that on there that you've mentioned, the age of consent as well as guardianship in the case of divorce is impactful. And I think the difference between Sharia courts, and correct me if I'm wrong, and secular courts is secular courts will decide custody issues on the basis of what's best for the child, whereas many times the Islamic courts will go with the Sharia or what's mandated. And can you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, the point is that, first of all, secular courts, obviously there's a lot of problems with secular courts as well. That's one of the arguments we often hear, is that even secular law is imperfect. Of course it isn't, but it is, you are able to push for changes in secular law. You are able to challenge secular law. The problem with law that's seen to be divine is that it is seen to be unquestionable. You can't question it, and to question it would lead to accusations of apostasy and blasphemy, which puts you in an even greater danger and a worse position, really. So that's the first point, is that you can believe in religion as a personal belief. You have a right to believe in whatever you want. The problem, though, is when it's part of the law, then what's happening is that rules are being imposed on women and children that doesn't take into account all the changes in laws. So even secular laws have changed so much in the past, even 40, 50 years in the US. If you can imagine the laws on for example, segregation or, the sort of, whether it came to schools or the rights Black people have had in America, and still today, the fact that Black people are more likely to be executed or face the death penalty or be prosecuted for crimes. There is all of that. Even so, it's possible to change it. And a lot of changes, positive changes in areas of women's rights, children's rights, and so on and so forth, have been the result of challenges to secular law. This challenge is very difficult when it comes to religious law. And what we're saying is that when it's part of the law or the state, then it's not anymore about religious belief. It's about political power. It's about one version of, basically the Islamists in this day and age, because they're the ones that have power, imposing their very narrow views on women's status, children's status, on the entire so-called Muslim community, many of whom are free thinkers, seculars, and who don't want to have anything to do with these laws. So, as you say, it's you're not able to challenge it. And if you look at child custody, that was a perfect example you raised. under British law, for example, now as a result of all this work done and activism around children's rights issue, child welfare is paramount, whereas under Sharia law, it's based on an age limit. So until a certain age, a child can be with his or her mother. After that, they must go to the father, irrespective of the child's welfare, irrespective of the fact that the father might be abusive, violent, and so on and so forth. Obviously, in a secular court, they might decide that the father is the best person for the child to stay with. That's based on child welfare issues, though, and not based on religious dogma. And I think that's what's so dangerous about these courts. Unfortunately, because we live in a world in which multiculturalism, not as a wonderful social lived experience, but as a policy, a social policy which segregates and divides people. Unfortunately, we live in a society and a world where multiculturalism is seen to be something progressive and positive. And so we see that communities that are so diverse are being homogenized and seen to be as one homogenized community. And very often, with the so-called Muslim community now, it's seen to be a religious community. And therefore, it seems to be all right to allow for religious leaders and imams to have say on what people's rights are meant to be. And don't forget, these are people who are citizens, very often the most vulnerable of our citizens, very often those who need protection by the law, and instead they're being marginalized and relegated to kangaroo courts, third-rate systems of justice. So it's quite worrying.
How are these courts able to operate with impunity? Are they actually illegal and under the radar, or do they supersede British courts?
Well, that's the thing. They're not illegal. And what's interesting is that the government will say that obviously if any of these courts decide on issues that violate British law, that women can come and challenge their rulings in a civil court. The issue, though, is that for many women, they cannot come and challenge those rulings in a civil court because, as I mentioned earlier as well, you could be charged with apostasy or blasphemy. You could be ostracized, isolated from those around you, your loved ones, your family, your larger friends and community. And so it puts women, and particularly vulnerable women, in a very difficult situation. And the other thing is that even though these courts are not meant to be dealing with family matters, the fact that they isn't illegal. And so, in a sense, they're allowed to carry on as usual. I think the other aspect of it is that the British government has for a very long time felt that if it appeases what it considers non-violent extremism, that it would help to reduce violent extremism in Britain. I think one of the things that is very clear, and we have evidence of it across the globe where Islamism has taken power, is that the sort of so-called non-violent extremism is very much linked to violent extremism. And why is it that violence against women is seen not to be part and parcel of that violent extremism? Whereas if you look in Iran, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Algeria, anywhere that the Islamists have gained power, that they have first attacked women and violated women's rights. They've targeted women first, whether it's with compulsory veiling rules, whether it's with the family code. So there are countries where the Sharia's criminal code isn't enforced, but its family code is. And so it is one of the so-called soft areas that they target first.
Does the UK have any statistics to suggest that this works, that violent extremism is down in England as compared to France or other European countries because of their policy? Because it seems to me, as an American, I don't know, this seems like they're opening the door to complete anarchy. What if every religion can have its own court? I mean, what next?
Yeah, I mean, again, the thinking behind it is very much, it fits in very much with larger austerity measures that are taking place. So this sort of the idea of privatizing the law, privatizing social services, handing it out to faith-based groups. You see that with Christianity as well. Mm-hmm. And also, don't forget, Britain is very different in the sense that it isn't a secular state. It is very much intertwined with the Church of England. The Queen is the head of the Church of England. You've got bishops in the House of Lords. You've got prayers in Parliament. So these sort of Sharia courts and so-called faith-based services are seen to be part and parcel of this role that religion plays in British society. Having said that, though, it is a very secularized society, and religion is on the decrease. So it's a contradiction, really.
I was just going to bring that up. It really is a contradiction, isn't it?
But it seems like, religion's on the decrease, in the Church of England and Christianity, but it seems like third generation Muslims in Britain specifically, it's on the rise, and that this is part of what's creating this problem in the Islamist narrative. Would you agree?
Yeah, see, I'm not sure I would agree with that fully. I think one of the things is that when the religious right wing gains power, it gives the impression that there is a religious revival taking place.
Interesting.
A lot of that revival is imposed, it's compulsory, even if it's not, even in the West, for example, even if it's not imposed by the state like it would be in Iran or Afghanistan, it is imposed by the so-called peer pressure and community and family trying to save face and honor. So, we have so many ex-Muslims who are atheists, who still go to the mosque, who still wear the hijab, I've got countless stories to tell you about this. And so I think when the religious right wing have power, it makes it give the impression that people are more religious than they are. And I think one of the ways we can see that is if you look in a place like Iran, where so many people lead double lives. They do something in the house, outside they behave differently. And even so, in the public space, we see a constant pushback and challenge, whether it's veiling laws, whether it's on the issue of gender segregation and so on and so forth. I think in Britain as well, there's this whole undercurrent of, this very undercurrent of people who are secularists, who are free thinkers, who are atheists, but may not necessarily be able to say it as vocally. It's interesting. I get a lot of calls from Muslims. Just recently I got a call from a 32-year-old Muslim man who's married with 2 kids. He was parked in some sort of abandoned street to call me and tell me that he's having questions, but he can't tell anyone that he has these questions. And he was crying on the phone, and I think that's one reality of it. The other is that you are finding that there are a lot of young people who were born and raised in Britain who are taking on the sort of Islamist narrative of things. And I think that has a large part of that has to do with the way that the British government has compartmentalized and ghettoized and homogenized Muslim communities right in Britain as well. So, when you make the space very tight and you diminish secular spaces, you diminish the concept of citizenship and the concept of human rights, irrespective of one's beliefs and background. You do start creating communities, imagined communities that didn't exist. So many of these young people, their families might have fled Islamist movements, or dictatorships and theocracies. Many of them aren't veiled, yet you find children raised and born in Britain who are veiled, who are joining ISIS. So I think, again, it goes back to this sort of this division between non-violent and violent extremism, and not taking that sort of ideology and Islamism as a political movement seriously.
Right. Do you think this is partially due to some of Saudi Arabia spending $200 and some billion over the past 25 years to export some of this ideology through books and funding of mosques and maybe even funding of imams themselves? Do you feel like is this related?
Definitely. I mean, look, they're all related. There are many factors that contribute to anything. There's not just one factor that contributes to it. So, there are people who will say that it's all the West's fault and it's all the fault of U.S. imperialism-led militarism and so on and so forth. I would say that that is one factor to why things are the way they are today. Look, if you look at the U.S. Government's role in bringing political Islam to center stage during the Cold War. That's a known fact. The fact that they armed and trained, the Mujahideen during the fight with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the sort of their desire to create a green belt, an Islamic belt around the Soviet Union at the time. The Iranian Revolution, for example, was a left-leaning revolution. It was a revolution against a dictatorship. The Islamists expropriated that revolution and did it via a mass killing, the slaughter of an entire generation in that country. A lot of people don't know about that. And that's something that will come out, hopefully, when this government is overthrown finally, once and for all. And people in Iran can live in a non-Islamic and in a secular society. But there's, for example, the Guadalupe conference where Western powers met and they decided that they prefer an Islamic state in Iran. And Khomeini, the sort of discussions they had around that. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, of course, the fact that I think multiculturalism as a social policy, and because it's not just what's happening in societies in the West, it's happening all across the world, the Iraqization of the world. Iraq has been divided into Sunni and Shia and Kurd, and we're seeing that sort of divisions. The concept of universal rights, the concept of citizenship has diminished, and as a result, all of this is feeding into the rise of the Islamist movement. And of course, even if the US had a role to play initially, it's now a movement that stands on its own 2 feet. It is vying for power, and we see that challenge not just in the Middle East and North Africa, because I think it's important to say that when it did happen only in the Middle East and North Africa, many Western governments didn't have a problem with it. It's only that it's now come into Western government territory that there's a problem with the Islamists. We often hear about since September 11th, but decades before that, this movement has been annihilating free thinkers in our regions, and no one even batted an eyelid, And yes, Saudi Arabia is one key to that, but don't forget who's, one of the closest Western government allies, Saudi Arabia. So there's different factors that play into it. I think Iran is a huge pillar of Islamism. In fact, I think if we look at the rise of Islamism in contemporary history, it is after the Iranian Revolution was suppressed by and expropriated by the Islamic movement, and the sort of exportation of the so-called Islamic counter-revolution globally. So even the Salman Rushdie affair is, the complete change in freedom of expression in the West, the fact that we can't criticize religion, whereas, criticism of religion is the most integral part of freedom of expression. And how the landscape has changed over the past several decades, that's what Islamism has done in many of our societies as well in the Middle East and North Africa. But with multiculturalism, culturalism, people will say, oh, that's their culture, that's their religion. Not seeing the suppression that's taken place and also the resistance that's taking place.
Right. It seems like the far left and what some people are, at least Maryam Namazie is calling the regressive left, is essentially allying or is somehow allied with the Islamists. I mean, accidentally, because they're so anti-colonialist that they actually will support some of these ideas. And it's funny because they seem to always, when it talks about extremism, say, but Islam is not, it's not a monolith. The extremists are a small version. But it seems like when it comes to family law and Sharia courts, it's like, but this is what Islam wants. No longer, now they are a monolith. It seems silly. They're playing both sides. Islam's a monolith. Islam's not.
I mean, I think that the far left, and actually I consider myself on the far left as well. I'm very much on the left. I think, the left has always been the banner carrier of social justice historically as well, fighting for secularism, fighting for free expression, against the death penalty, for refugee rights, for human rights. I don't think the far right or the fascists have been leading that fight ever.
No.
So, I think that's why I think this left has betrayed not just left principles, but humanity across the board, because where they should be at the forefront of challenging all forms of fascism, whether it's the far right, European far right, whether it's the Islamist far right. Instead, they are siding with the Islamists, and I don't think they're doing it, accidentally. I think, it's a far right a left, a so-called regressive left that does have an affinity with the Islamists. They see the Islamists as a anti-imperialist, as a resistance force, whereas in fact it's a force that is in and of itself suppressive and oppressive and part of the far right. It's interesting that they could fight against the European far right and they don't see its links with the Islamists, for example. So it's a very narrow view of it. And also I think, they've bought into the idea of multiculturalism as a social policy. They've turned their back on universalism and citizenship rights, which is why they are very happy to defend the burqa, whereas before they would fight for the right for women to burn their bras even, they defend the Iranian regime's so-called right to nuclear technology, whereas before they used to be at the forefront of fighting against nuclear weapons. I mean, it's just, I feel like it's such a politics of betrayal, betraying just common decency and humanity. And, the thing is that human solidarity has always been key in changing things that are wrong, that are oppressive. But what we have is with these type of regressive left, they're showing so-called solidarity with our oppressors in a sense. And what they're doing is they've turned their back on class politics and political ideals, which have been so key in changing things for the better. And so I think a lot of people like myself, activists who've been fighting against the Islamists, who are on the left, the reality is that across the Middle East and North Africa, in South Asia, a lot of those people who are at the forefront of fighting the Islamists, and not just the Islamists, the religious right wing, whether it's the Hindu right in India, the Buddhist right in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, the Jewish right in Israel and the Palestinian territories, the Christian right, very often they've been on the left. And so it's such a betrayal of those who they should be supporting.
Yeah, and perhaps I should call it the illiberal left, but those portions, and I don't mean to denigrate the left because they have been the champions of liberalism for the longest time, and many times you don't get that support from the right. But to bring it back to the Sharia law, it seems like part of this is like interreligious marriages, what to do, and even to get a divorce, that a man can simply say, I divorce you 3 times, and he has it. But a woman needs to apply through Sharia, and it has to get the man's consent. So sometimes if the man is moved back to North Africa or wherever he's from, it's simply impossible to get a hold of him, and they get trapped in this marriage where you can't even get a hold of it, so they can't even get a divorce. I mean, that the Sharia courts aren't helping this, that they don't have, or many times don't feel like they have a secular option, in addition to multiple marriages where, if she is a second wife, she has really no option at all through the courts, the secular courts, because we don't recognize
even in cases where she is raped by her husband, she has no recourse. She cannot file for a divorce.
Well, yeah, because you've got Sharia judges who've publicly said, actually, it's in the media that marital rape is not an act of aggression. Calling it rape is the actual aggression, because men should be able to have sex with their wives whenever they want. So it's that sort of idea where even with violence, well, what form of violence was it? Has it left marks on your body? If it hasn't, then it's not really domestic violence. And how many times was it? Did you ask him? I mean, this is things that have come out in the media. Did you ask him, why did you hit me? Was it because of my cooking? Was it because I didn't put makeup on when you came home? I mean, this outrageous, and the fact that they're still going on with impunity it just shows how little regard the government has for the rights of Black and minority women in this country. And that's why, in a sense, this fight back against these courts by Black and minority women themselves is very key. But I think the point is that any religious laws, you've got the Beth Din as well, the Jewish courts, where women are held in limbo for so many decades as well, because the husband refuses to give a divorce. it's all problematic, and we're calling for an end to any sort of parallel legal system when it comes to family matters, because it's so discriminatory, in particular against women. And as you said, the question of polygamy, a man can say divorce 3 times and he's done with it. And again, he may not decide not to give his wife a divorce because he can have up to 4 wives. Whereas for women, it's a very difficult situation. And we're saying, of course, women will want to get religious divorces. The problem is that it's not just women going to their clergyman or the local imam and talking to them. It's about the sort of parallel legal system that's been set up. Those who are presiding call themselves judges. They call their councils courts. And they do say that their rulings are rulings that cannot be challenged. They can't be appealed. They're non-appealable. So for all of these reasons, we're saying that these courts shouldn't exist. And I think it's also important to say that I know that people on the far right, people like Donald Trump, they use these courts and the sort of gains that the Islamists have made. I think not because they really care about women's rights or equality, because if you look at the religious right, they are very anti-women, anti women's reproductive rights, for example, anti women's role in the public space. Very often they think a woman's place is in the kitchen and in the bedroom and so on and so forth. I think all religious right-wing groups sort of perceive women in this way in general. And so it's important to take it out of their hands. But, some people will say, like there's a review now taking place in Britain. They'll say that, well, it's not all Sharia courts. Some of them are quite good.
Yeah, like in Birmingham.
Yeah, for example, they'll say that. But again, you have the Birmingham court. I had a debate with the woman judge who was there. And she was comparing polygamy with gay marriages. And of course, they're not the same. Polygamy is linked to violence against women. It's highly discriminatory against women. Gay marriages is a very different thing, but again, it's the sort of using rights language, something they're very good at, to dupe the public into thinking that it's just one of different types of marriage. And, I was telling her, well, what next? Child marriages, it's not ending if you talk about it as a choice and compare it with other types of marriages. They're very different things.
Yes, and the Canadian Council, and you may have been influential there, there was a 42-day look into whether or not these polygamous marriages were helpful or were they neutral, and that they decided, yes, there's an increased violence toward women and children. I mean, this is well sought out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, when you look at any relationship where inequality is so key in that relationship, there's going to be an increased risk of violence and abuse because of the nature of that relationship. And so it's, the relationship between a master and a slave. You could have examples saying, well, there were some masters who were really great and some slaves who didn't want to run away. But you cannot decide on people's rights based on examples, positive examples. Fundamentally, you have to look at things, and this is what I always tell people is the fact that even if you find people who like living in, like going to these courts, that doesn't mean that violations aren't taking place, first of all. And even if people like it, doesn't society have a responsibility to at least have a minimum requirement for citizens, Mm-hmm. And why shouldn't that requirement, those rights for Muslim women, for minority women, be less than it is for others in this society, or any society for that matter?
And I'm guessing, did you read Maktel Z's book when she... this is a Dutch PhD student who wrote her thesis and was actually invited into 2 different Sharia courts and hung out for several days and was taking notes. Did you read that? And some of the examples I wanted to read out, that, a lot of times the Sharia judges will call themselves arbitrators. That, it's just simply, a man and a woman with an arbitrator, but yet would quote, "As long as marriage is still sacred, it is our job to reconcile the marriage. But true arbiters don't hold agendas like this." That, the belief that marital rape is an aggression that you've mentioned before. And also talking about a woman who had repaid her dowry, because that's what you need to do when you divorce. And she's looking for a divorce for a man that she hasn't seen in 4 years, and was told, quote, "Debt isn't a cause for a divorce. Why don't you pay him more?" And even tried to persuade her to accept a polygamous marriage. I mean, this is something that you would not find, I don't think, in a secular court.
No, definitely, you're right. And I think this is the thing, you've got an Arbitration Act in Britain, and you've got it in other countries as well, where people can choose the arbitrator that they want and go and voluntarily can decide to have that arbitrator decide on their case rather than going to a civil court. And there's lots of arbitration tribunals, for example, employment tribunals, arbitration tribunals. Very often they're business-related ones where it's you want someone who's specialized in that area of business rather than going to a regular civil court. So obviously there's no point with arbitration. The problem when it comes to family issues is that, one, you've got two people who are coming to it. One of the issues has to be that they have to come to this on a voluntary basis. How much of it is voluntary when we know that there's so much pressure and intimidation involved? The second is that both those who come to an arbitrator need to be on equal standing. But we already know that under Sharia, for example, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's. So already, it's balanced in the favor of the man against the woman. And finally, any religious law as an arbitrator on family matters is basically saying that it's fine to violate women's rights, because, when it comes to religion and women in particular, it's just bad news.
Right. Even though, denying them their civil rights under British law. And all of this, I think, there's books been written by, like, Macfeld Z. You're obviously involved in this, but Yasmin Reham and Elham Mania, forgive me if I'm butchering these names, but have brought this to enough attention to where there actually is an investigation right now, and I believe an 18-month investigation led by Theresa May, who's appointed Mona Siddiqui and others to look into this. But you're saying that, can you tell us about that investigation and why your groups don't think that this is good enough, that this is kind of an unfair look at this?
To first, before I go into that, I wanted to you mentioned Elham Mania, and I think it's an important, she's a Yemeni Muslim herself, a human rights activist. She's a professor at the University of Zurich. Mm-hmm. She's done a book just recently published in May of this year on women and Sharia law, and her book also documents large numbers of cases in which violations are taking place, and opens up this link between Islamists and these courts, which I think is something that's often ignored and not enough attention is paid to this matter. So we're actually doing a crowdfunding campaign for her book to get her book into the hands of every MP in this country so they can better judge on this issue. So her book is a great one if people get a chance to get their hands on it. Now, we're saying that, thank goodness, there is an inquiry taking place. We need an inquiry into this. This is something we've been calling for almost a decade now. But we have a problem with the inquiry that Theresa May has begun and given it to Mona Siddiqui to look into. Mona Siddiqui herself is a theologian, and I think that's one of the problems we have with this inquiry, this Sharia review. The other is that she has appointed 2 imams to act as advisors to the panel. Now, we've also shown how these imams have said some really horrendous things about women, about gay people. We've transcribed some of their speeches. One of them keeps removing his videos that we've transcribed, which is interesting in and of itself, given the fact that he himself is not comfortable with his words being transcribed and out in the public domain, though he's one of the advisors to this review.
A red flag, for sure. But go on.
For sure, definitely. When Mona Siddiqui was asked on a radio program, which we had a debate on, she said that the reason they've ask the imams to act as advisors is because imams have their ear on the ground of the community. And again, it just shows how clueless she is with regards to women's rights. The last people women's rights campaigners or activists would go to is to imams. They're the last people who have any ear to any women's rights issue whatsoever.
Right. It's like asking the Catholic priest to prosecute their own scandal.
Well, you're letting the fox in the hen house. It's ridiculous.
Exactly. That's exactly the point we made. We said you're basically asking people who like the system, who think that it's positive for Muslims, to then come and investigate themselves, which is absurd. We're asking for a judge-led inquiry. We're asking for one that's independent. So rather than having a theologian as its head, it should have someone who's well-versed in human rights issues as its chair. And, the other thing is that the terms of reference are so narrow. It is basically assuming that Sharia courts are a good thing, but it's seeking out best practice. And we're saying that what needs to be looked at is the fundamental question of whether religious courts are good for women's rights or not. That the fundamental question, look at all the harm that it causes, all the violations that take place as a result of these courts being there.
The wrongness of this could not be more obvious to us. It's mind-boggling how any first world Western nation could let this happen. And we applaud your efforts. I can't even imagine what you're going through. Is there any inkling that this is going on in America anywhere? Do the Mormons have a court that kind of gets away with this and that? Do the snake handlers in Virginia try their own people? Or is this really a European reaction to terrorism?
I think that the Sharia courts are a new phenomenon. They're relatively new, even in a place like Iran, or it's not like it's been there forever. And I think it's for those of us who come from those countries where we have Islamists in power. I think for us it's very clear that this is part of the Islamist agenda. It's part of their project, whether it's the burqa, whether it's gender segregation at universities, whether it's the burkini. These are all parts of their sort of project and agenda. And so it's very easy to see that when you allow for these courts, you're not really helping the Muslim community. You are helping the Islamists to manage and control the so-called Muslim community and limit the space for dissent and transgression, because even if someone is religious, they don't necessarily want to live in the way that the Pope prescribes for them.
Right.
It's obvious, right? So I know, for example, in Canada, when I was active in the campaign against the courts there, where there was talk of them implementing Islamic courts, it was based on, Native Canadian courts that were already in existence there. So the fact that there are different laws for different so-called communities, I think is something that we really need to be concerned about, because it denies the whole idea that we're citizens irrespective of our beliefs. And I think, the reality is that even if you are a believer, you don't necessarily want to go to a religious court. I think there's ample evidence of that across the globe.
Right. Yeah, and you definitely don't want religious exceptions. I think, having like some of the Jewish courts have been active in a small Jewish community for a long time, and nobody's thought about them. That platform was used to be able to, kind of tail in Sharia, and this thought that some your religious views that you're exempt from the law in certain cases is problematic, because the Islamists will grab onto this to allow forward their agenda.
Right, and this has also been this already has been proposed in the U.S. It's been turned down, I believe, once or twice. I know Kentucky was one of them that was turned down, but I think that's the importance of what Maryam's work is part of that, because there's so many people listening to this show today that's never heard of this concept. And, you think of Saudi Arabia, you think of those, Islamic countries or theocracies, but you don't think of the UK, you don't think of the US. And
right.
As Maryam pointed out, this is new, and this could be, the next wave of things that the secular world has to challenge.
But don't forget also that this is a challenge to people who live outside of the West as well. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is that the fight against the Islamists is not a fight against Muslims, because there are many Muslims who, first of all, are not Muslims, in the same way that not everybody living in the US is a Christian. Not everyone living in Iran or Saudi Arabia is a Muslim. There are religious minorities, but also I think there's a tsunami of atheism, given the fact that no one hates religion more than those who have to live under its rule. I mean, it's clear. If you look at all the refugees fleeing, they're fleeing mainly from obviously theocracies and war, but also religious theocracies in particular, Islamists in particular. The highest refugee-producing countries are those theocracies. And why are they all coming to the West? Well, it's obvious. Who wants to go to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, like you did out of Iran in the early 80s.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important not to see this as an us versus them issue, because I think this is what the far right often frames this issue in this way, and it doesn't allow us to move beyond these sort of identities, these homogenized identities, and see how many allies we have amongst Muslims and people from Muslim backgrounds who are also challenging the Islamists at a lot greater risk as well in many cases, but that's not acknowledged very often. So I think it's a fight. It's a global fight, really, in the same way that you've got, someone who's European born going and fighting for ISIS. You have lots of people from Syria and Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan who are fighting for secularism, whether it's there or whether it's in Europe and the diaspora where they've fled to.
Right. And it's important that we kind of identified the illiberal left, but it's also, you're right, important to pick on the right, because you can be opposed to this Sharia, but you don't want to go so far to align with, say, the EDL or Pegida. You've been very, very critical of the Horowitz Freedom Center, for example, which combines kind of Muslims into a monolith and always accuses of taqiyya, which is a concept where, as a Muslim, you're allowed to lie if you're under duress. So then nothing is believed.
Yeah, then thanks for bringing that up. I wanted to ask Maryam, as a good activist will, she's pissed off people on both sides, and I think that's a natural outcome of her stance. But I wonder, in America we deal with a different problem. Maybe there's not Sharia courts everywhere, but we've set up a situation where we have to strike a balance between guarding against terrorism and going overboard in our anti-Islam sentiment. And I guess I'm asking, what's the solution? What's the ideal way to treat people of Arab descent, and so that we can both guard against fundamentalism, on the rise and going unchecked, and Sharia courts popping up here, and simply profiling every Arab-looking person.
Well, it's not Arab descent too. I mean, there's Muslims all over the world.
Clearly, but in America, we see, and the face of terrorism to the people is Arab, and that's a prejudice that we have to guard against. And Maryam, has been on the forefront of that, kind of trying to toe that middle line and guard against that kind of profiling. What is there? Do we need a third party? What is the real solution long term, Maryam, to that contradiction?
I think it's not a contradiction, because for me, I don't see homogenized masses. So I think it seems difficult if you see all Arabs or all Muslims as the same as Islamists. It's sort of like seeing all Americans as Tea Party activists and, Trump supporters. That's clearly not the case. And so if every white American who traveled abroad was, it was assumed that they were a member of the KKK or the Tea Party, it's that sort of perspective on Muslims, which, is problematic. I think the thing is that, I think it's quite simple, actually. Maybe I'm naive, I don't know, but I think it's so simple. It's, protecting people's civil rights, protecting freedoms at all costs, because freedoms are so crucial for the sort of world that we want. Defending freedoms, defending human rights, even the rights of people and the freedoms of people that we don't like. I think that's key, because otherwise it's meaningless if you only support the freedom or rights of people who you agree with. Well, that's you're not much of a human rights activist, are you? But on the other hand, it's seeing Islamism as a political movement. I think that's what is key, and how we will be able to battle it in the way that we need to.
Yeah.
Right now, it's conflated so much with Islam as an idea and Muslims as people that it's sometimes hard to see the differences. So it's seeing the difference between someone who's white, someone who's Christian, someone who's American, versus someone who wants to put a bomb, who's one of these white nationalists, who wants to bomb a federal building, for example. Yeah. So I think if you look at it as a political movement, you start to target those political activists rather than Muslims in general.
Exactly.
Because, the reality is 99.9% of Muslims also have no connections with the Islamists. My parents, my family, none of them would even know. They don't even go to mosque. They don't wear the veil. They don't, they might do. They will say they're Muslims, and they might, some of them will fast during Ramadan. To target them would be as preposterous as targeting any of you, because really, for them as well, they have absolutely no contact with this movement. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of the people who have committed acts of terror are known to the authorities, whether it's been in Brussels, whether it's been in Paris, whether it's been in Britain. They're known to the authorities. So why aren't those surveillance, targeting those would help with the limited resources that exist rather than targeting everybody? And also, why aren't those people being arrested? I mean, I don't understand that. Like, we've got this case now of Anjem Chowdhury.
He finally got arrested.
Honestly, I mean, I was like, I think 8 years ago I called him an Islamist and said, they're all linked. And now it's coming out that they knew about some of the links that they had. Why haven't they arrested people like that? He's gone and helped so many people kill others, and he's just arrested now. So I think it's sort of focusing on the Islamist movement, whether they are considered violent, moderate, so on and so forth, seeing that as a political movement with different aspects to it, and challenging all those aspects. So not just the terrorist wing, but also the political wing, the legal wing, which is, for example, Sharia courts, the sort of attacks on women's rights, whether it's on the burqa or gender segregation at universities, dealing with it comprehensively, I think, would do a lot more than just profiling Muslims.
Right. I think that Anjem Chowdhury, I saw on Fox News, interviewed by Hannity, and I think that shocks the people, because there's no way that 99% of Muslims believe what Anjem does. I mean, he really belongs in jail. And I think a good example of what the common Americans or Westerners would say, well, where are the moderates? Why aren't the Muslims speaking out? And I think many times it's because of the Islamists. Their first target is the Muslims themselves. There was an example. I'm pretty sure I read this either from you or during my research. In 2011, Usama Hassan, who is an imam in East London, his father is an Islamist. You'd think he'd be somewhat protected, but he said to his congregation that it was okay for them to believe in evolution. Not that they had to, but it was just okay. And that it was okay for women to unveil in public. You didn't have to, but it was okay. The result being, a few weeks later, an Islamist group breaks into the congregation, distributes flyers saying all of those that believe in evolution are apostates and deserve death. He was eventually pressured into apologizing, and it was eventually booted from the mosque, which gives you an idea what happens when moderates speak up sometimes, is they can really be bullied by the Islamists. So many times what we have to do is be aware of that and uplift and support Maryam and the many others that are really pushing for secularists, the moderate Muslims, that their voice is suppressed under threats of violence.
Yeah, I mean, just two things. One, about Anjem Chowdhury, he's not in jail today because of his beliefs or what he said. It's because of what he's done. And I think that's key. Even despicable, racist, bigots, Islamists, they have a right to express themselves. They have a right to believe in what they want. But this goes beyond the question of freedom of expression to actually inciting and instigating violence and harm against people. Now, on the issue of where are the moderates, I mean, that question really pisses me off, because it assumes that Muslims are a homogenous community. Look, I don't come out every day in the public space as an atheist. I come out sometimes as a women's rights campaigner. I come out sometimes as a secularist. I come out sometimes as a refugee rights activist, and so on and so forth. What I mean is that a lot of Muslims will come out as secularists and without even mentioning their religion, because religion is not the only identity that defines them. For a lot of people, religion might be the least important marker for them. But because of the way things are set up today, it's only those who identify as Muslims in the public space who are seen to be legitimate representatives. But many who do are part of the Islamist movement. Of course, not all. There are lots of reformers and, progressive Muslims. But again, that even framing it in that way is a response to the sort of situation where you cannot even exist without some sort of reference to religion. Even when you look at the ex-Muslim movement, it alludes to that fact that we would not be heard if we called ourselves atheists. We had to call ourselves ex-Muslims, one, to challenge the Islamists who say we can't leave Islam, but to even be considered as people who should be part of some sort of discussion, by framing it in the sort of religious context. And so I think the thing is that if you look, there's a book that Karima Ben-Noon has written quite recently. It's called Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here. And she's interviewed over 300 people from Muslim backgrounds, including atheists and secularists, with people who are believers, who are challenging the Islamists at great risk to their lives. Those are the so-called where are the moderates. They're everywhere. Yeah. In Iraq, for several months, there were hundreds of thousands of Iraqis coming out onto the streets every Friday saying neither Shia nor Sunni, but secularists.
That's great.
In Afghanistan, you have women coming out and saying, cut the hands of the filthy merchants of religion from our societies. Until we do, we will continue to have women being killed. There are all these protests. The problem is that even in the media, the only ones you hear from are always the Islamists, or even those who are challenging them. It's always, Tommy Robinson and the far right. It's sort of the way things have been set up. And so you need to dig a little to be able to see the resistance. But you have to, first of all, believe that resistance exists. If you think that all Muslims, because they are Muslims, they are not capable of believing in rights and freedoms and so on and so forth, well, I can't help you there. But if you can understand the fact that they are people just like you are, and that they will also challenge discrimination and racism, and also Islamism and religious theocracy and rules and transgressions, then you can maybe begin to see this immense resistance that exists. And if you see it, then you'll be able to realize that that's your movement.
Yes.
We are all fighting on the same front.
Yeah, uplifting the Muslim secularists.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there any legitimacy? I'm sorry. Is there any legitimacy to the claim that some of these some women are true believers who accept their role in the fundamentalist world in Islam, or do you believe that every woman would choose personal freedom over if they could simply be unindoctrinated?
Well, look, I think, people, there are women who are Islamists, and they choose to be Islamists.
You debated one from Hezbollah Tahrir on a British TV show.
Exactly. So I think, and that's why it goes, I don't buy into identity politics. I hate identity politics. The sooner we get rid of identity politics, the better off we'll all be. It's because it doesn't see the politics part of it. It just sees identity. So, you'll hear people saying, oh, how wonderful, there's a woman Sharia judge. Well, who cares? A woman or man, it's legislating misogyny. It's sort of like the Gay and Lesbian Association and the Feminist Society of Goldsmiths University siding with the Islamic Society rather than myself when they came and tried to disrupt my talk there. It's because just seeing identities, Islamic society is automatically seen to be a minority and vulnerable. Meanwhile, they are promoting the Islamist narrative, and someone like myself who's a minority within a minority, according to them, is the aggressor because of identity politics. Any criticism of them is seen to be something that's negative or discriminatory or incitement of hatred. And so I think part of it is that situation that we're in. We no longer see solidarity with ideals and political movements, but with so-called identities. And that's one of the main reasons why we're in such
deep trouble. The enemy of my enemy is not necessarily your friend. American foreign policy found that out with the Green Ring. I mean, I just wanted to kind of wrap a bow on your efforts on the Sharia courts and your One Law for All campaign, and also I think Baroness Cox pushing the equality bill. Like, where does this stand? Where does Sharia courts and the activists against this? What's current?
We have made some great inroads. The fact that we're even able this year to gather the signatures of nearly 200 women's rights organizations and well-known personalities to support our call for a independent inquiry and not the one that Theresa May set up, that would have been unheard of 5 years ago, because it's just, it shows that things are changing, that there are women's rights groups now who are seeing this as a women's rights issue. Again, this wasn't the case a decade ago. And also, definitely there's been some changes and we've made some gains. For example, we were able to get the Universities UK, which is a regulatory body for universities in Britain, to withdraw its endorsement of gender segregation at universities. The Law Society had issued guidance to lawyers saying that they can issue Sharia-compliant wills.
Yeah, and ask an imam, right?
Yeah, it's sort of. Well, but no, lawyers actually doing it themselves. Wow. So institutionalizing it in the legal system. And again, we were able to challenge that, and the Law Society not only withdrew its note, but it apologized. So we have made these gains, and these are just the result of many, many years of hard work, work that wasn't seen really, and we're just being seen now. And I think with Elham Mania's book, with the fact that now we were able to gather testimonies of women, it's all on our website now, One Law for All. We're able to highlight this issue in a way that we weren't able to in the past. We've got a lot more facts, a lot more documents, but also we've got a lot more people listening to us and seeing this as a human rights issue. But I think it is an uphill battle, mainly because the sort of Sharia courts, religious courts in general, fit in with the sort of anti-austerity measures. They're cutting legal aid all the time, and they're outsourcing justice to these sort of courts. And so, it's linked with getting legal aid back on track again, if we're able to do that, if women are able to get the help that they need. But also, it's challenging this whole concept of multiculturalism as a social policy and insisting on citizenship rights and universal rights. So that's a long fight ahead for all of us in all of our societies, not just in the West, but internationally as well.
Right. Well said. As we wrap it up and let you go, we really appreciate you coming on today. Is that it's onelawforall.com? Is that the best way? How can people help your cause as we leave you here today?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. One is supporting One Law for All. I think it's .org.uk. Also, ex-Muslim, the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. It's an important challenge to Islamists. It's another aspect of it, but it's challenging apostasy and blasphemy laws. And it's also breaking the taboo that comes with leaving Islam. So that's an important fight as well that people can help. And of course, the Bread and Roses TV program that you mentioned is broadcast in Iran in Persian and English via illegal satellite dishes. And it's been called immoral and corrupt by the Iranian regime. We have a Patreon site where people can give even $1 a week to support the program. So these are all ways that people can help. But I think the most important thing is for people, no matter where they live, is to see how intrinsically linked their lives are with people living in Iran or Afghanistan or Iraq. To see, the Islamists see themselves as an international movement. They do see themselves, they're linked from Iran to Iraq to Pakistan to Saudi Arabia, they're all linked with each other. We secularists, rationalists, free thinkers, atheists, we need to be linked internationally as well. And to do that, we need to see beyond homogenized communities and to start seeing individuals, many of them wonderfully brave, great individuals, many of them fleeing for their very lives and that need to be supported and welcomed here in the West, but also people fighting in the Middle East and North Africa that need support and solidarity. And with the internet, there are no more excuses. The world is so close now. It's so easy to support others. Sometimes it's just a click of a button. And I think we can all play an important role in changing things for the better.
Yeah,
well said.
Your book that you mentioned, Al Haminia's book, that is Women in Sharia, and that just came out in 2016.
Maryam Namazie, thank you so much again for joining us. You have a great night.
Absolutely.
Great. No, thank you for interviewing me as well. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Maryam Namazie, really excellent guest to have on Big Score. Thanks, Sean, for that. Really good job.
Yeah, just a privilege to talk to her.
on.
Extremely knowledgeable and somebody who's absolutely frontlining like this.
Well, in an unbelievable situation. I mean, that's an absolutely unique problem. We've all got our dealings with with fundamentalism, and we've all got the fight that we're fighting. But to actually, go up against a court system and a government, a modern Western government, no less, to try to affect that kind of change, I would really kudos to her.
And speaking at colleges, right? She not only has like the Islamic Student Society, which is run by Islamists, like unplugging her projector, interrupting, as well as some of the illiberal left, also opposing the fact that she shouldn't be allowed to talk here because she's too controversial and offensive. I mean, to fight, you're fighting a two-front war, and to persevere is incredible.
Yeah, and an absolute honor to let her just go for an hour. So we neglected to punch up our own stuff, which we usually do. We do want to remind everybody to get those tickets for the big debate coming up here in October,
October 21st, 2016,
at Turner Hall Ballroom. Downtown, in conjunction with Myth Information Conference 3, you can see Robert Price and Bart Ehrman finally debate whether Jesus ever existed at all, and get those tickets at mythicistmilwaukee.com. Coming up next week, we have Amanda Metzges, and she will join us for the normal podcast. That's all I got. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care.
The Mythicist Milwaukee Show is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee. Producer Sean Frasek. Associate producer Melanie Lawson, engineer Jason Lawson, Mythmeister Antonio Blandone, researcher Kristen Whitaker-Hood. Closing theme written and performed by Shelley Siegel. On behalf of co-host Brian Edward and the entire team, I'm Rob Moore reminding you to keep it safe and to keep it secular.
Okay, got it.